All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, I'm starting a new series. I'm just going to do maybe a handful of videos on this one, on this book, as you can see on the screen there, called Anarchism and Other Essays. And this video is about prisons, because this essay in that book by Emma Goldman is called A Social Crime and Failure. So it gets into, it's relevant to today's culture because, of course, in reaction to the George Floyd being murdered by cops, members of Black Lives Matter and supporters of it were talking about defund the police, and people meant different things by that, but some people meant that prison should literally be abolished, which is interesting because this is an anarchist position, which is why I think it's an interesting coincidence that I found basically this position in this book that I read the other day about anarchism. Okay, so as I said, but we'll get back to that part later. I'll explain more about this author and the book, and of course, specifically this essay first. So what we'll go to, so to get into the book in general first, let me see here. Oh, okay. So Emma Goldman, this is Emma Goldman here. You can see she looks kind of like ugly and angry, which is kind of funny. So she was a famous or infamous anarchist, depending on how you look at anarchism, during the women's suffrage movement. And she was a very interesting figure and very radical and controversial because she was a self-proclaimed feminist and anarchist. But as I said, this was during the women's suffrage movement, but even though she was a feminist, she was publicly against the women's suffrage movement, and she does a whole essay on that. I'll get into it more later, but basically her position is that the women's suffrage movement encourages the puritanical, patriarchal, sexist values that that feminism is trying to overcome, because people within the women's suffrage movement, some people already know, if you've studied alcohol prohibition, that the women's suffrage movement were very much on the side of alcohol prohibition. They wanted everyone to be teetotalers and never drink. So that aspect of Puritanism is true. And also she also talked about, he talked in that essay about how people who supported the women's suffrage movement wanted women to just play their traditional roles and be so-called quote-unquote barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen and raise the kids and do all the cooking and cleaning and whatnot. So that's why I think I understand the problems that she had with the women's suffrage movement. I just think, like with a lot of her positions, she just goes too far. But anyway, so she was also interesting because she was a Russian immigrant to America, and I don't know, there seems to be this sort of trend. There are only a few examples, but of Russian immigrants to America becoming libertarians or anarchists. Like for example, Ayn Rand is a famous one. Actually, I'm going to pull up a picture of her here. I'm going to go to Michael Malice. This is this guy, of course, if you haven't seen him, is another famous anarchist, and a lot of people know about him recently because he's on lots of podcasts. He's been on Joe Rogan's podcast, Lex Fridman. He and Dave Smith, the Anarcho-Capitalists, talk a lot of the time. And there's Dave Smith here too, the comedian / anarcho-capitalist. Even if you don't agree, even if like me, you don't agree with all of his political views, some of them are pretty cool, like, being anti-war and promoting the legalization, taxation, and regulation of all drugs and prostitution. And so but like economically speaking, in my opinion, I disagree with libertarians and especially anarcho-capitalists. But anyway, that's for those of you watching who don't know. I'm sure most of you probably don't. The difference between an anarchist and an anarcho-capitalist, I'm not exactly sure, but I believe that an anarchist just wants to basically like abolish all institutions, all government, and I'm not sure, maybe like massive corporations as well. I'm not sure, but anarcho-capitalists specifically definitely make this distinction that they think that we should abolish all governments and basically like corporations should run anything, or not corporations specifically, but capitalism, totally unregulated capitalism should control everything. But another interesting aspect of Emma Goldman here is that she is an anarchist, but she's also an anti-capitalist, which I think is interesting. And I'm going to look up a picture of Ayn Rand here because, of course, as many people know, she was another famous example. Like I said, there are only a few that I can think of off the top of my head, but she's, of course, another famous example of a Russian immigrant to America who became a libertarian, and she's, of course, famous for founding this philosophy called objectivism, which is basically just like valuing the ego as a good thing and specifically selfishness as a good thing. So if you selfishly pursue profits, then you benefit other people because you create products that other people buy, which of course is a fucking completely oversimplified and ridiculously simple narrative. But she's famous for writing books, basically novels that and nonfiction, which I haven't read, but she writes novels putting forth her philosophical perspective of objectivism, like Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, for example. I've read Atlas Shrugged. I think that's the only one of her books that I've read, but I thought it was pretty good. Like she's a beautiful writer, regardless of whether you disagree with her, whether you agree with her political opinions or not. So anyway, to go back to the book here, what we're going to talk about here is that book, Anarchism and Other Essays. So Emma Goldman, who I mentioned here, we're going to talk about Anarchism and Other Essays. And let me see. So that's this book here. Are you guys seeing that? Yeah, okay. Wait. Oh, okay. I gotta stop and share a new tab with each one. Okay. So you guys didn't see a lot of what I was showing you there. So I didn't realize that's how screen sharing works here. So I'm going to reshare a lot of those tabs that that I was showing you there. So let me see here. Like so anyway, here's the tab for that book, Anarchism and Other Essays, which I'm going to be talking about. That essay, Emma Goldman's essay on prisons. And let me see here. I'm going to show you I'm going to show you the pictures that I meant to show you here that I forgot to do so. Let me see. That one. Didn't I? Oh, I see. So, and I showed you Emma Goldman here, right? So that's the like kind of ugly, angry looking feminist anarchist who had some really interesting positions. Oh yeah, actually I forgot to mention too, another interesting aspect of Emma Goldman, and another thing that makes her so radical and different from a lot of anarchists you might hear from today, like Michael Malice, for example, who advocates for peaceful revolution. Emma Goldman, she advocated for political violence, including literally assassinating politicians. So she was certainly a very radical anarchist, to say the least. And And oh yeah, I pulled up some cool symbols here of anarchy in general that I'll show you here. So of course, a lot of people know that this is the famous anarchy symbol there, A for anarchy. I actually had a t-shirt of that once when I was a kid in high school. I got a t-shirt that's more like this one here. It's a black t-shirt with the red A for anarchy symbol, just because I thought it was cool and rebellious. I didn't even really have any fucking clue about what anarchism actually is. So anyway, I will screen share this one here too, because another interesting interesting image that came up when I was just looking for images for this video is, of course, V from V for Vendetta. Fucking awesome movie. If you haven't seen it, it's based on the comic book or the graphic novel rather, by Alan Moore, and he worked on Watchmen and a lot of other famous graphic novels that got made into movies. And the movie was produced by the guy who produced the Matrix trilogy too, which is interesting if you didn't know that. And it's a fucking awesome movie where V for Vendetta, I bet Emma Goldman would actually approve of V for Vendetta because, like I said, she approved of and advocated for violent revolution and assassinating politicians, which V does in V for Vendetta, right? So yeah, check out that movie if you haven't seen it because it's fucking awesome. But anyway, so to go back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago there, I mentioned some other well-known anarchists or libertarians. Of course, as I mentioned, there's a distinction between libertarians, anarchists, and anarcho-capitalists. And Ayn Rand was a libertarian, as I mentioned, and she wrote Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead. And like Emma Goldman, she was a Russian Jew to America and then became a libertarian and started promoting it everywhere, which is very similar to Emma Goldman. And then, so Ayn Rand's libertarianism, because people always lump these together, and I'm personally not a libertarian, an anarchist, or an anarcho-capitalist, but like I said, I personally agree with some of their views, but think some of them are dumb, which is basically my position on every political ideology, like progressivism, liberalism, conservatism. Like, I agree with some of their principles, but disagree with others. But anyway, so Emma Goldman, as I showed you before, she was an anarchist, and then also, but Ayn Rand, as I pointed out, was a libertarian. And then, actually, we'll go to Michael Malice first here. Michael Malice, again, I meant to show you that picture earlier, but I think I accidentally didn't show it to you. So Michael Malice, a lot of people know, as I mentioned before, he's been on lots of podcasts. He has his own. He's been on Joe Rogan's podcast, Lex Fridman, his podcast, as you can see here. And he hangs out with Dave Smith all the time, who I will show you here too. And he's, of course, a very well-known comedian and anarcho-capitalist. And again, so there's Ayn Rand, who's a libertarian, which I believe that libertarians basically just believe in as little government as possible. Like, there's a certain type of libertarian called a minarchist that believes that, I believe that they think that governments should only exist for protecting property rights and for courts and for instituting laws or something like that, I think. And then an anarchist like Michael Malice or like Emma Goldman goes like full extreme, no government, not necessarily any capitalism either, although I think that Michael Malice often sounds much closer to an anarcho-capitalist like Dave Smith here, who's, like I mentioned, he's a well-known comedian who's also been on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he talks with Michael Malice a lot, and they have very similar ideologies, but possibly different in that he thinks that basically, like, the thing that I think is weird about anarcho-capitalists is that they basically have this metaphysical belief in capitalism. Like, unregulated capitalism fixes everything, bro. Totally. Like, government is always the problem because life is really that simple, bro. But yeah, anyway, that's Dave Smith, as I mentioned. And so let's get back to the book and the article here. I just wanted to clarify specifically what anarchy means, which Emma Goldman follows here, of course. So again, we're talking about, just 1 second here. I can close that one. So we're talking about the essay in her book called Anarchism and Other Essays. And of course, we're talking about her essay called, I believe, the essay is called Prisons, a Social Crime and Failure. So she, of course, has this really extreme anarchist view on prisons, and I think this is a great image of prisons there, just a typical one with a guy holding the bars. And she, I think in the essay, basically, she and a lot of anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, libertarians, people like that, and progressives in particular, too, they really point out the fucking flaws in prisons. Like, especially back during the women's suffrage movement when Emma Goldman was around and popular. I'm sure she's dead now, but during that time, especially, prisons were even worse. And it was even more of that aspect that you still see today, which is an essential problem with prisons, which is that you go there and it's fucked up. Like, I've never been to prison, and maybe I've only like seen movies and TV shows in which people are in prison, and I'm sure a lot of the bad aspects are exaggerated, but I also have at least one relative who's been to prison and has talked about how awful it was. But, you can go in there and get beat up all the time, get raped, get your food stolen, all kinds of shit like that. And they really, like Emma Goldman talks in the essay about how they really dehumanize you and they take away your human rights because you're not treated like a human anymore. You're basically treated like an animal who needs to be put in a cage. And she doesn't offer an alternative solution. She just thinks that all prisons should be abolished. Like, she doesn't propose any better solution, just that this kind of shit should end, which I can understand. But where I disagree with this personally is that I think we do need prisons for like extremely fucked up and violent people. But then again, an anarchist or libertarian anarcho-capitalist could, or even some progressives, because as we mentioned earlier, this relates to George Floyd being murdered and the defund the police hashtag, by which some people meant abolish prisons and some people just meant reorganizing the funding in police and with police, and including mental health officers and that sort of thing. But anyway, so the like, prisons are totally fucked up, and the way that they're organized, particularly North American style prisons, from what I understand it correctly, they're better in that one of the essential problems with prisons is that they focus on punishing the criminals and then don't focus on changing them from being criminals. So in other places, like some of the Nordic countries, don't quote me on this, I think maybe Sweden is one of them, but there are a bunch of those sorts of countries that have prisons focus much more on rehabilitation than prisons, so that instead of what happens in Canada, where I am, and in the US for sure, and in all over North America and other places as well, like maybe Europe, for example, instead of someone going into prison and then connecting with criminals, doing drugs, being involved in crime when you're in prison, and then you get out, you have new connections and you learn how to be a better criminal, because that's what my uncle, who's been to prison, has talked about. He said, when you go to prison, you learn how to be a better criminal. So you come out, you have more connections with criminals, and it can be very easy to slip right back into crime, because with a criminal record, you're going to have a much harder time getting a legitimate legal job, and you need a job to make money to have a house, and you don't want to be homeless on the fucking street. And from what I understand, at least in the States, and I don't think this is true in Canada, but I haven't double checked, so it could be. It's legal, at least in some states. It's illegal, at least in some states in the US, for you to be homeless. So you could, in those states, you could come out of prison, have no job prospects, have a much more difficult time getting a job, and in order to have money to live and not be homeless, like not live on the street, it's not your only option necessarily. That's important to emphasize, but it's almost your only option to go right back into crime, because that's the only way you can make money so that you can eat and survive and live in a house or an apartment or somewhere like that and not be starving on the fucking street. So the way the prison system is organized incentivizes criminals to continue this endless cycle of going in and out of prison and being criminals and just not members of society forever, because prisoners don't even get to vote, right? Which is fucking stupid. I think that I would agree with probably what anarchists say about that, and that they should be able to vote. Although I think that most anarchists and libertarians and anarcho-capitalists think that voting in general is just fucking stupid anyway, so maybe they wouldn't. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, so Emma Goldman does sure as fuck point out all of the problems with prisons. As I said before, I think her solution is just a little extreme, but she does point out how completely fucked up prisons are, like I said. So anyway, as I said before, this is relevant in today's culture because, like I said, with the murder of George Floyd by cops and other similar cases that started these riots by members of things like Black Lives Matter, they started things like this hashtag of defund the police. And like I said before, some people mean different things from that. And one of the problems with this sort of thing being as politicized as it was is defund the police. Like I said, people meant different things by it. So some people meant literally abolish it. The most extreme that I saw, and this was a family member of mine who believed this apparently, was abolish all police, abolish all prisons, abolish all military, because it'll be just totally fine when like white supremacists attack Black Lives Matter people, or as you saw in the States, QAnon Trump supporters storming the Capitol violently, because in their mind there was a illegitimate election, and they were reacting to the violent riots of the polar opposite left-wing, like Antifa, Black Lives Matter violent riots earlier, like in the summer, right? So obviously, like, you need some cops and military and prison. You need, like I was saying before, you need prisons for people like fucking serial killers, like violent criminals. Take those non-violent drug offenders out of the fucking prisons and focus on putting violent criminals in there, I would say. And geez, like, defunding the police, I can see, like I said, I can see how that would make sense if you're talking about something like don't militarize the police, demilitarize the police, and you don't need to fund like these fucking tanks and all this fancy shit that makes cops look like they're going to fucking war. But I agree with people like Jocko Willing, for example, who said that you should train the police more, because if you train the police better, they'll be less likely to fucking murder people, like as does happen, although people do exaggerate about that too. And if you have like some sort of mental health professional, like a social worker, maybe they're with a cop, so there isn't any sort of negative violent altercation, maybe that would be a good idea. But I mean, what the fuck do I know? And what the fuck does almost everyone who comments on this know? Probably about as little as I do for the most part. But anyway, so with what some people meant, and not this right-wing caricature of all Black Lives Matter people being Marxists or some shit like that, and everyone who says defund the police, meaning literally abolish the police, abolish prisons, and abolish the military and everything. There are people. Most people had more reasonable opinions, but like I said, there certainly are people who literally meant abolish prisons by defund the police. And there are a few pretty cool images here of that. So this one, these people, and this woman's holding at the sign says no new jails, and a lot of people are agreeing with them about that. And yeah, let me see here. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm going to close that, then go back to that one, then go back to the first one. So, yeah, so there are a lot of people who do believe that prisons should be abolished, right? And this is an interesting subject. I mean, and it has enormous consequences. And like, this is just an interesting issue to think about. What do you think about this? Tell me in the comments. Do you think that prisons should be abolished? Because I would kind of agree with Emma Goldman, the anarchist, radical anarchist perspective, that prisons are a social crime and a failure, and they're totally fucked up. But I don't think that all prisons should be abolished. What do you think? Tell me in the comments, like I said. Do you guys think that prisons should be abolished? I mean, like I said, you can point out a hell of a lot of problems with them, but should they be abolished? Is that the solution, or is there a better solution? This is a very complex problem, and it's multifactorial, like most of these issues that people oversimplify based on their political ideology. So anyway, regardless of what you think about this, I think this is a fascinating subject to examine and contemplate. So just think about it more, you know? And yeah, so this is the first essay. I'm not going through all of the essays in Emma Goldman's book called Anarchism and Other Essays, but I'm going to go through some of the other ones that interested me the most, whether I agreed or disagreed with them. And an interesting aspect of this book, like most political books I read, is that I agree with some of positions but disagree with others, and many aspects like that. So anyway, look forward to other videos on that, and I'm probably going to focus on this one for now, and then I'll go back to continuing my other philosophy, or, well, this is more political, but philosophy book series on Foucault's book called The History of Sexuality, and on Slavoj Žižek's book called Less Than Nothing, which is about Hegel's aesthetics, which I'm doing a series on, explored through the perspective of many different authors, including Slavoj Žižek and many other famous philosophers, like even Kant and so on and so forth. And I'm also going to continue my series on Epictetus's Stoic text called The Art of Living. And so look forward to that. And then this Sunday, I'm going to do another podcast with Dusty and Tristram, who always participate with me in discussing fantasy novels. And we're going to talk about Hero of Ages, Mistborn Era 1, Book 3, which will be really exciting. And yeah, next week, I'm also going to do a podcast with Chris James, who joins me for the movie chats with the rest of the crew. And we're going to do a podcast about eugenics. And I've got others that I keep mentioning that are going to happen very soon coming down the road. There's going to be another theological chat with my Christian friends and my atheist epistemologist friends. And we're going to do another chat about police brutality, which is related to this subject of prisons, with Michael Wood Jr., the former cop who I talked to before. And so, yeah, anyway, like I always say, thanks to those of you who watch this video. Thanks a lot to those of you who subscribe to the channel. Please do if you haven't already. Thanks to those of you who click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos, like all of those ones that I mentioned and more. And thanks to those of you who share this everywhere. Please share this as widely as possible. And thanks especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that more than anything else, and it means a lot to me. And I'll post the link for my Patreon page in the description of this video, as I always do. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And read fascinating political and philosophical books, whether you agree with them or not, just because they investigate fascinating ideas from interesting and different perspectives. That's one of the many joys of reading. All right. Also, read more books. They're great. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and audio.